Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. My name is Liz Remerswell, and I'm co-facilitator and founder of Pacific Peace Network alongside Annette Brownlee, and also with World Beyond War, and I'm leading our discussion today. Welcome everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all those who have helped with this petition and with the webinar, and thanks for sharing this around your networks. And a big welcome to our wonderful speakers today, and I'm going to introduce those before each of them speaks. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Te Mata a Maui, Hawke's Bay, where this weekend we celebrate with a new public holiday, Matariki, the Māori New Year, lighting fires on the beaches, midwinter swims, a season of new beginnings, and acknowledging loss. Well, today I am in Sydney, Australia, and I wish to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as the first and traditional custodians of this land. In the words of Reverend Ray Minikon, I acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move towards a place of justice and partnership together. As we join this webinar focusing on peoples living all around the Pacific Ocean, I acknowledge values that have sustained our people for tens of thousands of years, values of community, respect for the land, and stewardship for future generations. These living practices that guide us remind us that our actions today echo through time, impacting those who come after us. By drawing on the wisdom and traditions of people who have walked this land and swam in these oceans for thousands of years, we can create our future together. Today, I welcome everyone to the launch of our campaign with a call on governments to declare neutrality and prevent a U.S. China war. This is a peace and solidarity campaign by the people of the Pacific and Pacific Rim nations, led by Pacific Peace Network and World Beyond War. This launch marks the beginning and the propagation of this petition in every country. It will be presented in national parliaments and also, we hope, in the United Nations around the September Peace Day. As you well know, it's an auspicious and dangerous time with the world in turmoil. And even as we speak here today, there are over 30,000 troops from nearly 20 countries who are converging in North Queensland for Talisman Sabre military exercises. At the same time, it's the 80th anniversary this year of the atomic bombings in Japan. We are facing ongoing genocide in Palestine and continual environmental degradation. You could be forgiven for thinking it's all too much, but there's also too much at stake. And to combat despair, we know that action is hope and hope is action. Now, a few housekeeping details before we begin in a minute. And Greta is going to put the links to our petition in the chat. So, and shortly, Bevan Ramsden is going to be introducing the petition on behalf of PPN. Our event today will run for 90 minutes, and our wonderful Greta Zaro will let the speakers who have been given 5 minutes to speak when it's time to finish, with the exception of Ralph, who may have a little more time as he's our keynote speaker today. So we'd love if everybody can stick to time. We're also recording this event, and we'll send out an email after the event with a link to the recording. And you're very welcome to use the chat box to post questions. There will be a Q&A afterwards led by Annette. There is also captions enabled, so if you'd like to see the captions, just click the CC Live transcript button to enable Zoom captures. And if you have any trouble with that, just put something in the chat and somebody will probably be able to help you with that. Alrighty, so first of all, I'd like to hand over to Bevan, and Bevan is a stalwart of PPN and the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, IPAN. He's a former telecommunications engineer, a technical teacher and trade unionist, and a long-time peace activist who's been jailed for some of his anti-war activities. Bevan's a member of IPAN and editor of its monthly e-publication Voice. Welcome, Bevan, and thank you.
Bevan, you'll need to unmute.
Sorry. Sisters and brothers for peace, I'm speaking from the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney who have never ceded their land that I'm standing on. We in the Pacific and Pacific Rim countries have geographical and political commonalities. We are encircled by and have a border with the vast blue Pacific Peaceful Ocean, and we are also under pressure to massively increase our military spending. This pressure comes from the United States, whose Defence Secretary, Peter Hegseth, at the recent Singapore Defence Summit, declared that the US expects its allies in this region to increase their defence spending to 5% of their GDP. His justification was a possible imminent threat posed by China. He emphasised how the US is reorienting towards deterring aggression by China and made it clear that Donald Trump's administration defence strategy revolves around stifling the rise of China. The question which we, the people of the Pacific and Pacific Rim countries, are asking is, why do we have to respond to this demand by the United States? We are not threatened by China. Where is the dire urgency which demands such a huge distortion of our public spending on the military and at the expense of urgent social needs? The indications are that the United States is preparing for war against China, but cannot wage such a war from the west coast of the USA. It needs military bases, port facilities, airfields in the countries on the west side of the Pacific Rim. Without these bases, without the backing of the military forces, munitions, and manufacturing capabilities of the Pacific Rim countries, the United States cannot launch and sustain a war against China. This dependency gives our countries enormous preventative power. If we unite together and our countries refuse to be involved in such a war and adopt a neutral position, it is in response to the urgency of the situation we face that the Pacific Peace Network, with representatives from Pacific Rim countries and the assistance of World Beyond War, has developed this solidarity campaign, which is being launched today at this webinar. The campaign enables the peoples of each country in the Pacific Rim to say no to such a war and no to an increase in military spending for it, and to do this through a common petition, which is a call on our governments, and it reads as follows: for sustainable peace and the survival of our peoples and environment, we urge you, the government, to refuse to join military preparations for a U.S. China war, to declare you will not fight in a U.S. China war, to declare neutrality should such a war break out, and not allow your territory or waters to be used in such a war, including the collection and relay of military intelligence, sales of weapons, and hosting combatant troops and facilities. Now, this common petition can be accessed on the World Beyond War website, and the details are in the chat. Later this year, the petitions will be presented to our respective governments, and we hope to the United Nations General Assembly. Look, we are seeking tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of signatures for this campaign. This is our opportunity to tell our governments we do not want this war and we want everything done to prevent it.
Thank you, Bevan, for being so clear on our petition. And once again, we urge everybody to sign it and to be familiar with it and talk about it. Our next speaker and our keynote speaker for today is Ralph Regenvanu from Vanuatu, who welcome Ralph, and thanks so much for giving your time on a special family day. Ralph is a Fijian-born Ni Vanuatu anthropologist, artist, and politician who has been a Member of Parliament since 2008 and is currently Vanuatu's Minister for Climate Change. Ralph is a former director of both the National Museum of Vanuatu and the National Cultural Council and has worked to safeguard Indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage. In 2010, he founded the Land and Justice Party, focused on land reform, Indigenous rights, and good governance. More recently, Ralph has been a strong voice in global climate and environmental negotiations and an advocate for ambitious actions to protect vulnerable small island states. Leading one of the world's most climate vulnerable nations, he has championed Vanuatu's push for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate obligations and for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Over to you, Ralph.
Well, good day to all of us, and it's really a great pleasure for me to be able to be on this webinar and make a statement. And I want to thank the organizers, especially IPAN, WorldBeyondWar, PPN. It's great to join this space of activists working for peace in our region in this critical time where we are so endangered by the actions of a number of states who are arming to the teeth, especially in our region. You will know that Vanuatu has a proud history of being non-aligned. We have, when we became independent in 1980, our first Prime Minister, who was the leader of the independence movement, Father Waltolini, a priest, an Anglican priest, along with his colleagues, including my father, who was also a minister in his government, were very quick to take a clear stand that they will not join any of this big power alignment, this East and West, this Cold War and so on. Vanuatu was proud to host the Pacific Nuclear Free Movement meeting shortly after independence in 1982, and in 1983 we officially joined the non-aligned movement, NAM, and we remain a member to this day. And that is a conscious decision to not take any sides in what we are seeing emerging in the Pacific increasingly, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, where, as the narrative behind this petition says, increasingly we are being asked to choose. We are being asked to choose, and in some cases, and I'll use the example of Tuvalu as a recent case, where the Australian government signed an agreement with Tuvalu that it would give up its foreign policy essentially to Australia in return for assistance and a migration pathway because of the existential threat that Tuvalu is facing from climate change, which ironically, Australia is one of the main contributors towards, as one of the top exporters of fossil fuels in the world, if not the top. So in my work as the Minister of Climate Change and Environment and Energy of Vanuatu, I am really trying to get states to implement their obligations under international law, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the Paris Agreement, where everyone agreed that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels temperature of the world. And at the same time, the developed countries who caused the climate crisis would contribute finance to assist the adaptation of the less developed countries, like particularly Vanuatu and small island developing states. And this comes from what the states of the Pacific have come up with, which is our main statement on our security, which is the Boy Declaration. I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vanuatu in 2018 when we went to Nauru and came up with this Boy Declaration. And I want to read certain sections of it, because basically it says, recognizing the importance we, as the Pacific Island Forum member states, place on an expanded concept of security, inclusive of human security, humanitarian assistance, prioritizing environmental security, and regional cooperation in building resilience to disasters and climate change. And the strongest statement in the Boy Declaration, which is only like 2 pages long, is basically that we reaffirm that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, and our commitment to progress the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So that is what we see as our security threat. And that is our job, to try and get out there and get countries to reduce their emissions. And we are seeing that all the major players on the Pacific Rim are in fact not in compliance with international, not in compliance with the Paris Agreement, which they all signed on to, except the US. And we are in fact going the opposite direction. And international law, which is the only thing we can seize upon as small island states, as some of the smallest states in the world. We depend on the multilateral order working. And when we agree on something, we do it. And seeing that failing is one of the reasons why Vanuatu has been going to get advisory opinions from international courts. We got one from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea last year, which was very clear. The advisory opinion from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea said, for the first time, greenhouse gases are marine pollution, and therefore, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, all states have a legal obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions so as not to cause harm to the other countries that share the ocean. And we then went to the highest court of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and we are awaiting that advisory opinion, which should come out next month. But essentially, what we are calling for in this increased time of, sorry about those dogs barking, in this time of increasing geopolitical posturing in the Pacific, where we're being called upon to take sides. I want to quote what our police commissioner, we had a police commissioner newly appointed as of 2 weeks ago, and we don't have an army in Vanuatu. We have a police commissioner is the highest disciplined force member in our country. And he spoke to the representatives of the different countries who have security officers in our country. We have the AFP, for example, in Vanuatu. We have the French police and so on at that level. And I quote what he said. He said, "Let this be a message to all development and security partners. We are not proxies in a geopolitical game. We are sovereign equals. Your support is welcome, but your respect is required. Vanuatu's national interest must come first." And to repeat, our national interest is to see climate change addressed, which is the greatest threat to our future. And so we are very pleased to see this movement for a petition going. I will do my part as a member of the government to see if we can get governments to sign up, if we can see declarations made at this level, but for example, at the Pacific Islands Forum or in other regional state forums in the Pacific, because it's important that we put our voice out as states. Many of our leaders in the region are being, I would say, seduced in different ways by different sides. But recently, with the Trump administration's heavy-handed attitude towards other states, for example, Vanuatu, as of yesterday, was put on the restricted travel list of the US along with Tuvalu and Tonga. It sort of helps us to become not aligned at all and to be very independent and see what we can get from being friends to as many countries as we can without choosing sides and getting what we need in terms of our own development aspirations. So I think I'll leave it there. I will need to leave this webinar a bit early, but thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Ralph. Wonderful. Because Ralph needs to leave early, we're going to allow some time for questions now to Ralph. Does anybody have any questions? Already, I've got one for you if there's none coming through immediately, Ralph.
Okay.
China is, of course, one of the things that is posed, particularly by the US and its allies, as a massive threat in this area. Whereas, in actual fact, China seems to be one of the countries that is pouring aid into particularly the Pacifica countries. How do you view that dynamic?
Well, as you said rightly, we don't see China as a threat. We never have. It's really it's an Australian preoccupation, and I think US as well. I know from the history of Australia that it's something that's deeply ingrained in the Australian psyche, is this fear of China. But for us, not so much. It is another partner we need to be careful how we interact with, same as any other country. We have been able to leverage China's interest in the region for our own interests. I'll use an example of maybe I would say 10 years ago or 12 years ago, we were in need of good roads, good infrastructure. We could not get that from our traditional partners. We turned to China. They came in and were able to, with a concessionary loan, give us money to build roads on 2 islands. And since that time, Australia now has come up with its own concessionary lending, the Australian Infrastructure Facility, financing facility. So we were able to use this geopolitical imperatives to our own ends, and our ends are our own national development. But as we don't see China as a threat in the same way that we're being asked to.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Kuhan Pikemanda, who's one of our speakers also, Ralph. I don't know if you can see it. She's asking.
I can see that question on China and the US massive carbon emissions. Yes. You know, that we have this, they're mentioning AI causing much more emissions, but really, I mean, China and the US are some of the readily identifiable handful of states that are responsible for the greatest global greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. So AI on top of it, I mean, it's just more of the same. We need them to really do what they said they would do under the UNFCCC and really just phase out fossil fuel use. We can't be talking about, I mean, AI war, it just creates more climate change, and we just want that to completely stop. And these are the two main offending countries, China and the US.
Yes. Anna, is your hand up now, or shall I carry on with the questions?
We'll just carry on with the questions, Liz. It's fine.
Thank you. I'm sure that's a huge, and Kuhan will be talking about AI, etc. That would be an interesting question to talk about. There's a question from Jada wondering about how foreign extractive projects such as mining and energy have impacted Vanuatu, given the impact of extractivism on the other nations in the region.
We've been very fortunate in Vanuatu because we don't have any large-scale extractive projects, mining and so on. There is the looming threat of deep-sea mining on the horizon. But I mean, compared to Papua New Guinea, which has a lot of extractive projects in its territories, New Caledonia, we have been very lucky not to have those resources that could have made us financially rich, but spiritually and environmentally poor.
And
There's another
one
question there from Lisa.
from
How to address the forum's
Lisa,
capacity.
our speakers and from Guahan. How would you assess the Pacific Island Forum's capacity and resources to resist the US global hegemonic agenda? Additionally, how has the current US administration's deconstruction of US aid impacted this dynamic? And this might be our last question for now, I think.
I think the Pacific Island Forum leaders have not had a chance yet to respond to what Trump has been doing and saying. Normally, the Pacific Island Forum leaders meet the US president in the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. So we're expecting that is where there will be the first formal interaction between the Pacific Island Forum leaders and the US. You must remember that Australia and New Zealand are part of the Pacific Islands Forum, and they're a big influence on the other leaders in that space. So much so that some of us believe that the Pacific Island Forum in some ways is compromised because of their presence within it. When you talk about climate action, for example, the Pacific Islands Small Island Developing States Group, PSIDS, is the high ambition group, much more so than the Pacific Islands Forum. But yes, I mean, we try to resist this having to align too much. I mean, the US and China are both dialogue partners of the forum, as are other countries. And so we seek to balance out that representation and not go too much down one side or the other, similar to what Vanuatu does as a country.
Thank you so much, Ralph, and really interesting to also look at what's happening in Cook Islands on top of Tuvalu and the strong arm tactics that are being used.
Yes.
But we had better let you go back to your family obligations, and we look forward to. It would be wonderful if you can present this at government level and among your colleagues. Thank you so much for spending the time, and we look forward to ongoing communications and discussion with you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, big round of applause for Ralph. Our next speaker comes from the Philippines and is DJ Jania, who is the head of the campaign working group on exacting accountability in defense of human rights and indignity movement, and the Secretary General of Unity for Women for Freedom. DJ is also the head of the Secretariat for the Solidarity to Oppose Wars Coalition in Philippines. Welcome, DJ. Thank you so much for coming.
Hello. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Good day, friends, fellow advocates and defenders of peace. I speak to you today not as a Filipino, but as an Asian, a citizen of a region increasingly trapped in the tightening grip of superpower rivalry. We are gathered in here to raise our voices in support of a united petition for neutrality in Asia because the stakes could not be higher. Let me be clear that we do not want another war in Asia, not over our lands, not over our waters, and certainly not over the ambitions of foreign powers. Recently, we have heard the dangerous words from Pete Hegseth, a former U.S. military officer and Fox News personality who's standing in Manila and later again in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, declared that the Indo-Pacific is the next front of confrontation and that the U.S. will get involved in a real way. He did not speak of peace. He spoke of escalation, of confrontation, of war. And where is the Philippines in all this? Right in the middle. Our archipelago, once proud of its anti-nuclear stance and independent foreign policy, is now being turned into a forward base, hosting 9 enhanced defense cooperation agreements, sites or agreed location sites for the U.S., many located near Taiwan and the South China Sea. Military infrastructure is rising. Foreign troops are rotating. We actually have more than 300 plus war exercises with the United States and other nationalities in a year. Missile systems are being planned and being purchased. And behind this veneer of cooperation, or so-called cooperation, we are seeing clearly our lands are being turned into launch pads and our people into potential human shields. But it doesn't end there. Even our energy sector is militarized. We are seeing the United States and private contractors aggressively pushing for small modular nuclear reactors or SMRs near our EDCA bases. This isn't just about electricity, it's about embedding military logistics and expanding the surveillance infrastructure under the cover of civilian projects. And in this fog of geopolitical brinkmanship, we must ask, what's next? There is growing concern, including from international observers, that a false flag incident could be staged in the South China Sea. A provocation, a calculated spark meant to justify war. History has shown us many wars begin with lies. But if this happens in our waters, it is our homes, our fishers, our families who will suffer the consequences. This is not peace. This is not defense. This is imperial chess with Asian lives as pawns. And so today we issue a clear and urgent call to our government. Refuse to be dragged into the U.S. China war. Declare neutrality now. Do not allow our lands, ports, or airspace to be used for war. And reaffirm diplomacy, regional cooperation, and the sovereignty of our peoples. Because peace is not passive. Peace is a decision. Peace is a struggle, a fight for dignity, survival, and the future of our children. To our fellow peoples in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Guam, the Pacific Islands, and the Southeast Asia, we call on you to let us stand together. Let us not be divided by flags or treaties, but united by a common hope that our region may finally break free from foreign domination, past and present. To the Filipino people, we remember the U.S. military bases. We remember the environmental damage, the social cost, the nuclear accidents narrowly avoided. We must not let history repeat itself, this time under new names, new weapons, new deals signed without our consent. Let Asia remain neutral. Let us choose people over profit. Let us choose life over loyalty to empires. This petition is more than paper. It is the voice of mothers in Okinawa, the farmers in Pampanga, the students in Taipei, and the workers in Seoul, who know that wars are not waged in presidential palaces. They are waged in our homes, our communities, and our islands. Today we say together, no to U.S. China war, no to proxy conflicts, no to nuclear expansion and militarized energy, yes to Asian neutrality, yes to peace built by people, not imposed by power. Mabuhay ang mga mamayang lumalaban para sa kapayapaan. Let Asia choose peace. Let us remain neutral. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ. It's very sobering to hear you speak of the impact of militarism in the Philippines and inspiring that we can be working together. And there'll be a chance for any questions for DJ at the end of our webinar. Now it's time for our next speaker, who is Dr. Ross Gwyther, who is a retired unionist and geophysicist from Australia. He's involved for many years with Just Peace, a peace organisation which grew out of popular concern at Australian involvement in foreign wars not connected with the defence of Australia. Ross is also instrumental in establishing the IPAN network, Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Liz. I'm speaking here today from Meanjin, Brisbane, on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people. And ever since the invasion and the colonisation of Australia and the protracted resistance by Aboriginal people, Australians and our governments have had a very ambivalent attitude towards our Asian and Pacific neighbours. At a grassroots level, there's been a lot of interaction, at times friendly relations between people, at other times ruthless exploitation of Pacific peoples that really we in Australia have not yet come to terms with. Looking at Australian governments, they've looked always to distant and powerful countries to protect us from what have been mythical threats from neighbouring countries. For the first 150 years after colonisation, it was to Britain. And since 1945, successive Australian governments tied us ever more closely to the United States. And the underlying decisions that these governments make are most often determined by the power of the big corporate interests that dominate our economy, corporations that are largely foreign. We now have a situation where both major political parties in Australia see our alliance with the United States as the cornerstone of their defence and foreign policy. Yet Australians have stood up time and again against this subservience to imperial powers. In the First World War, millions of Australians voted against sending our young people to fight for a British imperial war. In the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, millions of people stood up against our government, tying us to the coattails of American aggression in Vietnam. And then in the 2000s, during that illegal invasion of Iraq, again, millions of ordinary Australians stood up against it. Today, a majority of Australians have made it quite clear they don't want to follow America into a war with China and prefer Australia to be neutral. Over half the people that we surveyed in IPAN a few years ago thought that we should end our alliance with the United States. Yet today, as you know, we stand really at the edge of a precipice. The warmongers campaign not only hard for a war against China, but for a widespread war in the Middle East as well. And over the top of it looms nuclear catastrophe. I think at present the most dangerous obstacle to peace is the United States government, and the cornerstone of their actions is a commitment to what they call full spectrum dominance across the globe. Yet, when you look at it, this policy is a facade. To use the famous phrase, it's a paper tiger, because it relies absolutely on the complete subservience of allied countries that have allied with the United States to provide money, to provide weapons, and most importantly, to provide young people's lives. The reality of that facade is showing us the solution to the terrible prospects we face. And I think for the Australian and peoples and peace movements, we have two urgent tasks ahead of us. The first task is to build a broad consensus amongst Australian people for a genuinely independent government, one that's neutral and not aligned with any of the big power blocs, one that abandons AUKUS treaty and our alliance with the United States, one that disbands plans for nuclear attack submarines and for a greatly increased military industrial complex. And instead, we need to build a movement that actually will force our government to look at peaceful resolution of conflict as the way that they should engage with the rest of the world. But our second task, I think, is also important, and that's to work far more closely with our friends in peace and justice movements in other countries. We need to develop again that strong and influential non-aligned movement that grew initially out of the anti-colonial struggles, and it was great to hear Ralph talking about Vanuatu as one of those important countries. When you look at the war fever that's gripping Western governments and media, it actually provides us with a unique opportunity, because everyday people want peace, not war. And if we keep that in mind, history is on our side. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ross. And I'm just going to mention a question because I think it's important. And I think, obviously, I mentioned earlier that we are also very concerned about the genocide in Gaza. And you didn't mention that in your talk, but do you have a comment to make about that before we move on?
Oh, I think, and IPAN has made some very strong statements suggesting that we need to look to the interests of Palestinian people, that we are seeing a genocide being carried out every day in Gaza. And now that war is spreading between Iran and Israel, and it's essential that we actually try and bring some peaceful resolution to those sort of conflicts, but also bring justice to the people of Palestine. And there's been massive movements in Australia, and particularly of young people, calling for that. And I think that's a new development in the whole peace movement around the world, is the massive movement of young people calling for real justice in Palestine.
Thanks very much for clarifying and explaining that, because it is important as what is going on right now. And of course, Israel does work with many of our allied powers and our own nations who haven't declared full support for the people of Gaza yet. So coming over to South Korea, in Ganjeon village in Jeju Island, we have Kaya Karivaredi, who has lived there for nearly 10 years in solidarity with the peace movement against the Jeju naval base. And she also works very closely with Sung-hee, who I see is also here today. Kaya is actually a US citizen, but she spends a lot of time listening to survivors of past wars who have inspired her, and who work to stop future wars and to be part of the community in Ganjeon village. Welcome, Kaya. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. I'm glad that I can use this opportunity to oppose the policies of the U.S. government, which are causing not only threats of war, but killing people continuously throughout the world. And so I will start to share. I did prepare some slides today. I am living in Jeju Island, South Korea, and I think it's important, especially to witness how the U.S. militarization is threatening democracy, the environment, the safety of people who live near and near bases and war games, and in addition to how U.S. militarization is threatening the broader region with danger of war. So Jeju, I should mention the history here. In the so-called Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, this island was the site of a massacre over 10% of the population when the South Korean troops were following U.S. orders to massacre the people here who were accused of sympathizing with communism. And that legacy has continued to affect the fear of people to speak out against the United States, and yet also the understanding of how the danger of militarization is not just theoretical, but has been very violently experienced right here. So I've been part of the resistance against the Jeju Naval Base, which was proposed in 2007. And for many years, people were active to block the construction. Gangjong villagers and people who joined them in solidarity physically blocked construction for many years, but the base was finally completed in 2016. And we've continued to monitor the ongoing impacts of the base locally and how the base is now projecting not only the South Korean military involvement in war exercises, but a place that the United States is using. Perhaps it's the United States hoping just to use South Korean money in order to use this base more cheaply, and sending ships here often as part of war exercises. So recently in South Korea, we've experienced how the threat of war is also a threat to democracy. When Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in December, that was after already trying in many ways to incite conflict with North Korea and take advantage of how the Korean War was never formally ended with the treaty, and to use that as an excuse to claim dictatorial powers. And even though Yoon Suk-yeol was impeached and there is a new president, that threat of war continues to prevent true like free foreign policy or even decisions within South Korea. I also want to mention how the U.S. government, the U.S. military has operational control of the South Korean military in the event of war. And so that is another way that the United States is not only threatening the possibility of war, but using the excuse of war to prevent true democracy here already. So I also want to mention war drills, not only between the United States and South Korea, but now even this past week, just off the south coast of Jeju Island in the skies, there were exercises between the US, South Korea, and Japan. And those kinds of exercises are increasing. Also, South Korean forces get sent to war exercises. Here at the Jeju Navy base opposition movement, we focus a lot on how the Navy is being sent to join in the RIMPAC war exercises in Hawaii. But the South Korean military is being very much involved in U.S. preparations for war, as well as, I should mention, the war industry. The South Korean war industry has been increasingly supported by different governments in South Korea. And that is not just heightening the risk of war theoretically, but those weapons and those technologies are currently being used, for example, by Hanwha and its connections with Israel. Those are being used in the genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza. So in
Your
conclusion,
time is up. Sorry, can you wrap it up? Thank you.
okay, I hope that this neutrality petition will inspire people in places like South Korea, whose governments are closely tied to the U.S. military, and those in the U.S. itself to oppose the preparations for war and we will be encouraged by the example of neighbors who demonstrate alternative foreign policies which are not based on military aggression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaya. And any questions for Kaya, please put them in the chat for soon. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Natividad from Guam, who is a professor of social work at the University of Guam and is on the International Peace Bureau Council. Lisa is a convener of the Guam Coalition for Peace and Justice and a founding member of Ihagan Famalawa Guam. She is an indigenous Chamorro who has championed the exposure of the human rights violations against her people in homeland Guam, which is a military colony of the United States. Lisa has spoken globally, including at the UN, on the topics of demilitarization, decolonization, and the critical role that women play in the creation of safe and thriving communities. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Liz. Hafa everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces in this webinar. Our colleagues, of course, in Australia as well as throughout the Pacific. I wanted to begin first with sending our condolences to the people of Australia on the loss of our comrade and sister and champion, Dr. Hannah Middleton, and as well, if Ralph were still with us, to send his condolences to he as well as fellow Ni Vanuatu in the loss of our sister Hilda Lini, both of whose leadership has been an inspiration for us all in the Pacific. And so I wanted to first start by talking about how on Guam, we are a non-self-governing territory, akin to that of being a U.S. colony in Micronesia. As a territory, the issue of neutrality is kind of a moot point because we lack the political power as an entity, as a political entity, to be able to make those decisions for ourselves. And so in these discussions on neutrality, there's roughly 17 of us who are on this list across both the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. None of us are in the position to declare our own neutrality, all being and part of and populating the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories. We in the small Micronesian islands have paid the price of militarization. Guam, of course, for many people that look at military histories, is a buzz place because of our role in World War II, as well as in the rapid militarization of our island that has been ongoing, particularly since 2006. And so our experience with militarization, of course, has not been a pretty one. At the beginning of our story is the subjugation of our indigenous peoples, Chamorro, along with our lands, our waters, our resources and territories, and clearly without any free, prior or informed consent, utilizing the UN's construct. And so what we've been able to experience as a result of the military presence here on our island, of course, which is not unique to us, we see throughout other entities in the Asia Pacific region who have hosted or coexisted with US military bases, has been toxic contamination that has resulted in poor health outcomes. Part of the contamination that we've been exposed to includes dioxins, agents orange, purple, red, as well as radiation as a result of nuclear testing in the Pacific. We are reminded by former Senator of the Marshall Islands, Tony DeBrum, who shared that what happened in the Marshall Islands during the period of nuclear testing was the equivalent of 1.7 Hiroshima bombs every day over a 12-year period. Part of militarization includes, of course, land dispossession and the taking of lands for military bases. In the case of Guam, 1/3 of our island, roughly 35% of the island, is taken by the U.S. Department of Defense. And so ultimately, in the case of colonies such as Guam, results in the deferral of the right to self-determination. Bevan, as we began this webinar, talked about how Australia does not have any direct conflicts with China, and certainly nor do people of Guam and most of us in the Asia Pacific. Nonetheless, we have been heavily fortified with massive growing military capacity. And because of this, we've become targets. We were literally named and called out we've been named and called out by China as well as North Korea in the past. And so with or without our consent, because clearly we have not consented to it, we've become complicit in this posturing against China without our free, prior, or informed consent. And so the latest build-up efforts here on our island has included the development of massive missile defense systems. I believe our sister from the Philippines had mentioned that as well, where the U.S. DoD's current footprint continues to expand. And just to give you a little bit of deeper context for those of you in Australia, our island is 212 square miles, which is roughly the size of Adelaide proper. And so we in Wuhan are grateful for the PPN's efforts with this petition, the great legacy really coming in the Pacific following the NFIP, or the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement. And this focus on genuine security with a vision for common security and neutrality is really critical and central in this day and age. And so we call, of course, on the need to demilitarize and denuclearize the Pacific and the entire globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa, and also a special thank you for mentioning the contribution and the loss of Hilda Linney, and also Dr. Hannah Middleton, who was a tremendous force for peace. And myself and several others in this webinar attended her funeral yesterday. It was very beautiful and moving. And she was giving right to the very end. It was particularly moving when when Dennis, her husband, told us that Hannah offered her body as a donor, and 2 people have benefited from the use of her eyes, her beautiful brown eyes. Anyway, a wonderful person. May she rest in peace and justice. Our next speaker is also from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and he's actually a very old friend of mine from back in our Radio New Zealand days. Eugene Doyle is a writer based in Wellington. It's also midwinter and Matariki in New Zealand. He's been for a swim in the Chile Cook Strait this morning to celebrate Matariki, which is the Māori New Year. Eugene has also written extensively on the Middle East, as well as peace and security issues in the Asia-Pacific region. He's a member of Just Defence, a Wellington-based peace group which advocates for an independent foreign policy, especially anti-AUKUS. And he hosts the public policy platform solidarity.co.nz. Welcome, Eugene, and so lovely to see you, my friend.
Kia ora koutou, ko Eugene Doyle. Thanks so much, Liz. Yes, and well done to all the organisers and those awesome speakers we've already heard from. Now, I thought I'd like to do a couple of shout outs, and they basically contain the kind of messages I'd like to make. And one of the people who may have been here, but he's off in Europe, is my friend Pascal Lotaz from Neutrality Studies on YouTube. If you don't know these people, please check them out. I'm in awe of the work that Pascal does in Neutrality Studies every week and the impact he has. And that's kind of what I want to say. You know, some of his videos are picking up 250,000 views. You know, quite often he gets 100,000 views. And in this battle for ideas, that's really important. So I guess I'm aware myself, and I think we all need to think more about how can we reach more people? You know, where else can we share our stories? How can we leverage our databases more intensely and effectively to win this battle for truth? Because we sure as hell have we're on the right side. We got the right messages. And the other shout out I like to do is another old white boy, forgive me, is to my good friend David Roby, the editor of Asia Pacific Report. You know, David a while back sent me an advance copy of his book Eyes of Fire, and it's the story of the final voyage of the Rainbow Warrior. And David was on it for about 11 weeks before the French government's terror attack in Auckland Harbour 40 years ago next month. And so to mark that anniversary, Eyes of Fire has been updated. There's a new introduction from former Prime Minister Helen Clark, and I'm in the midst of writing a story, obviously, about this. And I hope you will buy lots of copies of Eyes of Fire when it comes out next month, and share those stories, because they're not just sort of gripping and really surprising. I've been delighted reading the book, but it's so relevant to so some of our speakers today have been touching on some of these issues, but so relevant to the times we're living in right now. Now, I'm a part, as Liz said, of a group called Just Defence. It's been doing some great work this year, opposing US ship visits. Theoretically, we've got the strongest anti-nuclear legislation in the world. I'm not so confident of that, and we particularly don't want US ships in our waters while we're in the midst of the Gaza, the genocide being committed in Gaza. And we're also, deep into challenging our governments about the massive increases New Zealand has just made to its defence spending, so that we can be a force multiplier, in the words of our Prime Minister, for the Americans. And at the same time, we're seeing $100 million ripped out of the mouths of children, reductions in school lunches, and all sorts of measures where we seem to be prioritising an upcoming war with China over actually looking after our own communities. So all of us have a focus on opposing the AUKUS alliance. New Zealand has slowly been dragged into this kind of military framework that's aimed squarely at China, who is our major trading partner. So we don't want to be part of that. But truth be told, we actually are a long way off having a peace movement in Aotearoa that's big enough to really take the fight effectively to our government. And finally, I'm working on a story. Asia Pacific should be hoping Iran wins. And the nub of the argument runs like this. Setting aside all the horrors of Israel, setting aside the illegal and despicable violence the US and Israel have just unleashed on Iran, the article looks at what the knock-on effects would be if they actually won, if they managed to defeat Iran and topple the regime. And it would mean it would be an event that would bring war against China so much closer and drag so many of us in our region into it. And because, Iran's one of the three pillars of the emerging Eurasian bloc, and it's part of a project that's currently integrating the Eurasian landmass. And there's hundreds of billions of dollars already been spent. There's hundreds of billions of dollars being spent, largely unreported by our media, on road, rail, port networks, digital highways, all sorts of things. Everything needed to bring integration within a multipolar, multi-nodal framework. And that's one of the reasons the US wants to knock out Iran, weaken and isolate Russia, and then move on to China. Absolutely mad, incredibly dangerous, which means they're probably going to do it if they can get away with it. So the work all of you are doing to oppose militarism and inform our communities of these dangers, of the immorality and the futility of war with China is enormously important. So well done, everyone. And I love that message about let's link up a whole lot more together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugene. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. I'm sure we will continue to work together even closer, and we sure need to. Our final and very esteemed speaker for today is Kuhan Pike Manda, who is a Pan-Pacific peace activist with intimate ties to Korea, the Mariana Islands, and California. She has co-authored the book, The Super Fairy Chronicles, Hawaii's Uprising Against Commercialism, Militarism, and the Desecration of the Earth, with her late husband, Jerry Mander, and has written for many publications about environment, technology, and Asia-Pacific geopolitics. Kuhan has chosen not to share her video for reasons that she might like to explain, to do with the impact of AI and information, etc., which she is a very far-reaching visionary in her understanding about this topic. Thank you, Kuhan, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you for understanding my choice to not share my visual data. And I hope all of us do get on that bandwagon, because what we are doing when we do Zoom calls is we're helping the military train their AI. And thank you, Pacific Peace Network at large and World Beyond War, Greta, for showcasing the importance of neutrality as the truly democratic position, or in the case of colonized nations, sovereignty. Democracy is what people want. And it's just wonderful to share this space with so many brilliant and caring fellow Asians and Pacific Islanders. So over the past, almost 2 decades, I've been protesting in solidarity with fellow Asians and Pacific Islanders against the terribly destructive practices that have been described here today, designed by the U.S. that take place in order to prepare for war with China. I speak of primarily base building and these terrible war exercises, displacement of populations, building bases. Universally, the people of the Pacific and Asia do not want these destructive practices. They want to be neutral. They want to be sovereign. But the U.S. and the autocratic governments of its vassal states have pushed these ecocidal war preparations onto the precious peoples and precious places of our precious Pacific. Sinophobia has been a long-standing theme in U.S. culture, dating back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Opium Wars, the seizure of Hawaii, Guam, Okinawa, the Philippines, etc., to project military power towards subjugating Asia. But the most recent expression of xenophobia is this current plan for war with China. These plans do not include neutrality as an option for the nations of the Western Pacific. And when I say nations of the Western Pacific, I'm also talking about the colonized nations. We've got to change all this. And thank you for this declaration to start this initiative and process. If we don't do this, the role of these Pacific nations is doomed to simply be as sacrificial proxies for empire. So here's a bit of history on all this. In 2008, Eric Schmidt, who happened to be the CEO of Google between 2002 and 2020, CEO of Google, he was a major donor to the presidential campaign of Barack Obama. Once elected, Obama appointed Schmidt to chair the Defense Innovation Advisory Board that he actually had created for Schmidt. Schmidt was the architect of the current blueprint for war with China. He was a key designer in overhauling warfare to run on completely new weapon systems that were networked and included AI, robotics, satellites, 5G, and unmanned missiles and drones. The idea of war with China justified this costly transformation of warfare into the realm of IA and robotics. It was an obsession of Schmidt's through both of Obama's terms, through Trump's first term, through Biden, and still to this day. Under Trump and Biden, Schmidt co-chaired the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Schmidt's overhaul of the U.S. military translated into stratospheric profit for his company, Google. And this overhaul would be massively expensive for tax-paying citizens. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been poured through the years into research for new kinds of long-distance weapons and missiles, and also base building in places like Palau, Pyeongtaek, Palawan, Pohakuloa, Liteksan, Amami, Miyako, Ishigaki, Chejido, and many, many other precious Pacific spots. This was all part of the grand, foolish scheme to contain China. War with China was also the motivating force for an unprecedented increase in Pacific war games, which provided an opportunity for the weapons industry to ensure regular profits year after year as each seasonal weapons upgrade was obliged to be tested during these military exercises. So to ensure the regularity of these profits, Obama's Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who was extremely close with Eric Schmidt, took multiple trips starting in 2015 to an assortment of Asian client states peddling the wares of the U.S. arms industry like a traveling salesman. As a result of these weapons sales, we saw military practice in the Pacific explode into a frequent seasonal activity, like the World Cup, Talisman Sabre, Balikatan, Cope North, to name a few. These and many other exercises did not exist before Carter's sales tour. They directly and indirectly account for the deaths of tens of thousands of whales and dolphins and turtles and innumerable species of sea life per year. The U.S. game plan for war with China is predicated on the specific commitment of 4 key allies: Australia, the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung, is a peace lover, and even before his election, the tariffs fiasco imposed by Trump resulted in such disgusted pushback by South Korea and Japan that they formed a coalition of nations that included China. That means 2 of the 4 pillars that had been positioned by the Pentagon to stand against China were standing with China. This is highly significant. If Australia and the Philippines would also exercise more of this kind of national sovereignty and declare neutrality, the whole game plan for hegemonic war would just collapse. So let us never forget, Pacific means peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kuhan, and all of our wonderful speakers. I'm going to hand over to Annette now for the Q&A.
Wow, amazing sharing of so much important information from all of our speakers. We are blessed to have them all joining us as part of the Pacific Peace Network. So we haven't got a lot of questions in the chat. We do have one from Kuhan, which I'm going to share now. And it's a question for Kaya. To clarify, didn't the US-backed massacre, which killed 10% of the Jeju population, take place because the islanders were declaring themselves to be neutral, and that was perceived by the US to equate with being a communist sympathizers? Would you like to take that on, Kaya?
Sure, I briefly answered the question in the chat. I think that now when we look back in retrospect, we think like, oh, could people have anticipated that being labeled as communist would lead to so many deaths? Could they have done something different? But I think that we have to look back at history with a sense of what was happening at that time. And the situation of people who were in labor unions in Japan when they were forced laborers who were under colonial occupation, forced to go and work in Japan. To hear communist ideals within the context of a labor union is a very different idea to what many people think of as communism, based on the kind of teachings that people hear in schools in the US, for instance, without a fuller sense of what that kind of ideas could have been shared back at that time. So I've made this answer even longer, but I think that to say that people were being controlled by the Soviet Union would be absolutely wrong. And the ways that people use excuses to condemn people, like the ways that people may be condemning people in Los Angeles right now, I think we have to be very cautious about making blanket statements that come from a very far off perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. That's important to look at this in context of history. And there is another question here, but I've got a hand up, and I think at this stage we've got sort of really just another 10 minutes or so left in this time frame. So if you do want to ask a question yourself, put your hand up. I might just go to the one from Bevan to DJ. Isn't the presence of US military and bases contrary to the Philippines Constitution? So Bevan, if you can, DJ, if you wouldn't mind giving a quick answer to that, and we'll then move to other people who would like to put their hand up.
Wait. So hello? Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Contrary to the Philippines. Yeah. Okay. So technically, the way they're saying it is they're not U.S. bases. They are Philippine facilities that are being used by foreign troops. So that's the way to skirt the provision in our constitution that does not allow for that. The same way, our constitution also does not allow for nuclear weapons. But of course, as you know, U.S. frigates or ships that come in do have are nuclear capable. So in a way that also skirts the issue. So we actually have the phenomenon of the United States opening the agreed locations to other nationalities. So so we already have a security agreement with Japan. I think South Korea is in the works. We already have with Australia. New Zealand is up for ratification in our Senate. So you see where I think there's like around 19 or so countries, security agreements with 19 or so countries that are in the works. Thank you.
Thanks very much, DJ. Gray, would you like to pose a question to one of our speakers? Need to unmute.
Yes. Thank you very much. My question, well, is to all the speakers actually, but the thing that we're fighting against, the major tools that the United States is using, is the belief that China is an enemy, a mortal enemy to the West and to civilization, to democracy. And that is supported by a lot of information, a lot of history, a lot of prejudice, of course. But for those people who believe that that is the case, then I suggest that we need to. Is there any way of developing a strategy which would appeal to a person who believes that China is the enemy? Because otherwise they see us as a threat. They see us as a threat. They see the military as preserving their peace because it's resisting and deterring China.
Good point. Yeah. Thanks, Gray. Yeah.
So, yeah, is there any way of addressing that belief?
Thank you. I'm just going to pick one person to answer that just in the interest of time. And I'm going to go to Lisa, I think, as positioned so closely to China.
I think, that really is the $1 million question, right? Like, how do we sway the critical mass to move to resist in such a way that we end this madness of targeting China. And I think, you know, much as in the case of this webinar, really the critical thing to me is to expose the misinformation, to raise the hard questions so that people rethink the position and the rhetoric of what's being fed. You know, on Guahan, for example, the U.S. Department of Defense presence is very, very heavy. And their messaging in terms of quote unquote safety and national security really resonates for people, you know, and for an island community that experienced serious atrocities of war in World War II, the faith in the U.S. Department of Defense and its ability to quote unquote save us is very high, because that's one narrative of history that's been shared for decades now, right? And so I think the importance of just reframing the questions. One of the questions that we often have reframed locally here is asking the question, well, why was Guam bombed in the beginning to begin with, right? It's the heavy fortification of military presence here that brings threat. It has nothing to do with us on this island or our history as peoples. And so I think just creating spaces for those critical conversations is really key.
Yeah, well answered, Lisa. Thank you very much. Ross, got your hand up?
Can I
Briefly.
just add to Lisa, and I fully agree with what Lisa's saying. I think one of the things we have not done enough is actually putting it back onto people to say, what is the evidence for China being such a threat? And I think we need to somehow build that into our campaigning amongst ordinary people, because certainly there is a widespread feeling, as the question alluded to, certainly in Australia, that China is a threat. Yet when you ask people what do they mean, what is the evidence, they actually don't have any, as do neither have our government have any the evidence.
Thanks, Ross. Liz?
Oh, yes. There's a question from Suzanne in the chat there about...
Yeah, I was going to get to it. Yeah. So
Okay,
to
great.
Eugene, it'd be great to have Eugene answer that around people around the world are on the streets calling on governments to stand against genocide. And meantime, in Aotearoa, the coalition is opening the way for corporations to benefit from public funds at people's expense. How do we better link up demilitarization with the need to redress neoliberal policy since the 60s and 70s? Eugene.
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, well, it's interesting. The short answer is I'm not entirely sure how to answer it, but I think it's such a great question to pose, because, you know, I can't remember who said it the other day, that you know, at their heart, all wars are also class wars. You know, the wars generally by some flavor of oligarchs against ordinary people. And I think, yeah, trying to get better at understanding the multi-dimensional nature of wars. You know, like people often try to categorize wars as, oh, well, it's us against them, or it's the Chinese versus the Americans and all of that. And that's perhaps one dimension of that, but it's also it involves the American working class, it involves the Chinese working class, it involves working people, right, you know, through all of these countries. And, you know, those projects, those neoliberal projects are obviously part and parcel of all that. And, you know, I mean, gosh, we've seen it, just the astonishing transfer of wealth that's occurred in New Zealand, the even more astonishing transfer of wealth that's occurred within all the Western countries. And I'm sure the you know, our speakers from the Philippines and Guam, etc., you know, they'll have equally horrific stories to share. So I guess it's our job, it's our collective job, and it's a tough one to actually find the voices, and you yourselves are some of them, find the voices and then find the mechanisms to reach more people with those messages. I don't know if I got even close to answering your question, but I hope it was a contribution.
Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, and certainly an example of those voices is what's happening in Europe with the women amassing at in Brussels on Sunday, the June 22nd, So there's a huge number
In The
of
Hague.
friends at The Hague meeting there on that weekend. So that's an example of hope and solidarity that I think we're all trying to work towards. So just in summing up, a very big thank you to the speakers. I think all high quality. I'm sure this webinar recording will be put to good use for those that weren't able to attend, and to just, you know, share what you have all shared here today so importantly. Just a couple of things sort of coming up that just to let people know about. Well, first and foremost is to reinforce the petition. And as a number of the speakers have said, they take it on board, that they will ensure that this petition is shared widely in the countries that they are coming from, countries and states. I think that's the first action that needs to be taken if we do want to get thousands of people signing this petition, and in the process raising the whole need for, as Vanuatu has done, to have a neutral foreign policy, and to stand against the drive to have Pacific countries drawn into this potential war against China, largely aimed at undermining the economy of China and maintaining the dominance of the United States and its Western lackeys, which Australia is one of, to maintain an unjust hold on the world. So the petition is the main thing to emphasise again as we reach the end of this webinar. But also as we have done 2 years ago, there will be another Pacific Peace Conference to be held in Brisbane on the 2nd of August. We will have more information coming out to all of the people who are attending today. It will be a hybrid conference, but importantly, there will be people on the ground. We'll also be putting on a protest action in Brisbane around the Talisman Sabre exercises, the largest Talisman Sabre exercises ever held, with nearly 20 countries participating, 30,000 personnel arriving in Australia to prepare for war against China. There's no other country that you can identify in this part of the world that they are preparing for war against. And that is the reality. This is preparation for that war. I hope it never happens. And part of why it won't ever happen is the sort of things that we've talked about today. So anybody who can attend the conference in Brisbane on the 2nd of August, we would very much welcome you. It will be hybrid. We've got Senator David Shoebridge from the third party in Australia. He's the representative on Foreign Affairs attending the conference. Ralph, that you heard from this morning, will be joining the conference, as well as representatives from the Northern Marianas, from Fiji, and many other wonderful people coming to this event. So again, thank you to everybody for coming along today, and also a big thank you to World Beyond War, Greta Zarro, for her wonderful management of these online events. And a big thank you to Liz for such a great job of facilitating today's webinar. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, everybody.